Great. Good evening and welcome to Bookhampton and RJ Julia Booksellers virtual event featuring authors Eric Nusbaum and Paul Goldberger. Before we get started, just a few quick Zoom housekeeping details for you. Please ask questions using the chat box function of your Zoom screen. We will get to as many of your questions as possible later in the evening. Though you're going to remain muted throughout the duration of the event, a Bookhampton staff member is monitoring the chat box and will forward your questions along. So send them on over. For optimal viewing, you can use Zoom view functions in the top right corner of your screen and select speaker view so that the speaking author will stay highlighted throughout the duration of the event. And of course, please don't forget to purchase your copies of Stealing Home and Ballpark. Links for book purchases will be sent to you in that Zoom chat box. All right, so tonight, Bookhampton and RJ Julia Booksellers are thrilled to be able to welcome authors Eric Nusbaum and Paul Goldberger. Eric is a former sports editor at Vice. In addition to Vice, his work on sports, history, and culture has appeared in ESPN The Magazine, Sports Illustrated, Outside, The Daily Beast, Deadspin, and the Best American Sports Writing Anthology. Eric was born and raised in LA and has spent many hours both attending Dodger Stadium and sitting in traffic to reach those games. He has also lived and worked in Seattle, New York, and Mexico City. Tonight, Eric joins us to discuss Stealing Home, a story about baseball, family, the American dream, and the fight to turn Los Angeles into a big league city. Will Leach calls it a story perfectly told, riveting, moving, and deeply human. We are also thrilled to have with us tonight Paul Goldberger, who the Huffington Post has called the leading figure in architecture criticism. Paul's book, Ballpark, Baseball in the American City, brings us an entirely new look at the history of baseball. Paul is a contributing editor at Vanity Fair who began his career at the New York Times, where he was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for distinguished criticism for his writing on architecture. Later, and for 15 years, he was architecture critic for The New Yorker. He is the author of many books, most recently, Building Art, The Life and Work of Frank Gehry, and Why Architecture Matters. He teaches at the New School and lectures widely around the country on architecture, design, historic preservation, and cities. He and his wife live in New York City. Without further ado, please welcome Eric and Paul.
Thank you so much, Dana. Eric, thank you very much for doing this. I'm really excited that I'm excited we're talking about your book, actually, which here it is, which I really have loved. Good. Okay. It's an extraordinary kind of baseball book, because its entire premise is about the intimate connection between baseball and cities, baseball and place, and baseball and really the life of a city. And for me, it's one of the most revealing books about Los Angeles in the 20th century and all of the various forces that have played on that city, have shaped that city, have given it its character, and the intimate connection between this extraordinary history and baseball. I also love the idea of tracking the history of a city and all that it means in terms of community and people by looking at a piece of land and analyzing that chunk of acreage and what it has meant over really the whole 20th century, I think we could say. So Eric, why don't we start by just having you tell us why you grew up in Los Angeles. You went to Dodger Stadium as a kid. Lots of people grew up in Los Angeles and went to Dodger Stadium as kids. They didn't write Stealing Home. What led you, as somebody who's written about sports, covered sports a lot of your life, to write this particular story, and a story that by its very nature is about the connections between baseball and everything else. I mean, this book is at once all about baseball and yet all about everything else too.
All right. Well, thank you for the kind words. I feel like a undercard after hearing your bio read out loud. So the book is sort of kind of all of me, I suppose, and my life and career up to this point. When I was in high school, a man named Frank Wilkinson spoke to my U.S. history class. I write about this in the prologue of the book. Right. And he had been a housing official in Los Angeles who was blacklisted in the Red Scare as a communist. And he was really there to talk about McCarthyism. But his role in this very ambitious housing project that was slated to stand where Dodger Stadium currently does was what piqued my interest in the story. And I would say that as I kind of grew into my career as a writer and sort of started to read more and understand the world, this story came to represent the intersections of all my interests. You know, I was interested in history and in politics, and I was interested in baseball and in sports. And as I began to write more about baseball, I became less interested in who wins and loses and more interested in sort of what it all means, I guess.
Well, and indeed, that this is a book about that, and it's not about the, you know, it's not another trite baseball as a metaphor for the rest of life. It's baseball as an intersection with the rest of life, we might say, actually. And I mean, it is extraordinary to think that Dodger Stadium is kind of built over the grave of McCarthyism. I mean, if that isn't an overly dramatic way to put it.
I think it's fair. I think McCarthyism, I think it's built on the grave of, it's built literally over 3 thriving communities that were ripped out to build a public housing project. It's built it's built literally on the first Jewish cemetery in Los Angeles.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
It's built on a lot, you know, it's built on Tongva land. It's really, truly possible. And I was very tempted in the writing of the book early on, especially, to say, well, what if I take this thing all the way back to, you know, before Columbus and Cortez and just go big? But, you know, you have to stop yourself somewhere.
Yeah. I'm glad you didn't. Well, we should be glad that it isn't on the side of the La Brea tar pits, I suppose. Then you would have, you would have had to. No, but in fact, you know, I was very moved by the reminder that the site has, as you just said, so many layers of history, but all within the 20th century. I mean, I think, in fact, in a way, it's more powerful that you didn't go back earlier, because it would have made very big parts of the story just little parts of an even bigger story. And that amazing history of what would have been the most ambitious, I think the largest single housing project in the United States, that ultimately never happened. And all of the reasons why it never happened tells you so much about Los Angeles before the Dodgers even started thinking about Los Angeles.
Yeah, I mean, the story really, it's funny because one of the challenges in structuring the book was figuring out how to incorporate baseball in a part of it, because the beginning, in terms of the LA story, in terms of this land where Dodger Stadium sits, it was really a story about housing, and it was a story about the Red Scare, and it was a story about immigration and racism, structural racism in LA in the 40s and 50s. And that was really, those were the events that drove kind of the book and drove, I guess, history to this point where eventually Walter O'Malley could take the Dodgers to Los Angeles.
Right. Well, it certainly is a reminder that even though the earliest baseball parks, in the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, tended to be built on virgin land as cities were expanding and growing, like Fenway Park, for example, and many of the early Brooklyn ballparks and so forth. this is the opposite. I mean, this land had a very complex and fraught history already, and it was partly cleared for the housing project that didn't happen. And then, of course, the city was desperate to put it to some use and continue clearing it. And they wanted to make the deal with O'Malley. Can we talk a little bit more about exactly that and how O'Malley, I don't remember, did he consider other sites, or was this the one that just felt right to him?
This was the one that drew him to come to LA in the first place.
Okay.
So
Right.
the land was cleared out for like the brief history. The land was mostly cleared out by 1952 or so, but a few
Right.
families that lived in these communities, Palo Verde, La Loma, and Bishop, had refused to leave because they were ostensibly kicked out to build a public housing project.
Right.
The public housing project was then canceled. So these residents said, well,
Canceled because of actually pressure from the right,
absolutely.
which considered it to be an exercise in socialism, which
Yes.
Los Angeles didn't want. Right.
And the question over whether single family homes or public housing are the future of kind of how we're going to house people in LA and probably America too.
Right.
So these kind of few remaining, not too few, but pretty few remaining families, mostly Mexican-American families, had this long drawn-out legal battle with the city of LA saying, you can't take our homes under false pretenses to build a housing project and then not build it. That's unjust. And when the city decided to try to use the land to lure Walter O'Malley and the Dodgers to the west, it became even more heightened because the land had been taken with eminent domain, which meant that it had to be applied to some sort of public purpose. And there was this big debate over whether a privately owned baseball stadium would meet that public purpose clause. And ultimately, the city, it was close. The city voted on it in 1958, right after the Dodger move, and it was 52% yes to 48% no to build the stadium. So really just by a hair.
Right.
And even after that, there was still a possibility that the Supreme Court would reject the deal, which they ultimately did not.
Yes, it went all the way to the Supreme Court, though.
They just decided not to hear the case.
Right.
But it could have.
Right. But as a result of all that, of course, the Dodgers spent not 2 years playing in the LA Coliseum, but 4 years.
Yeah, the worst place to play baseball.
Back.
Imagine.
Yeah, exactly. Which was one of the worst places imaginable to play baseball. But then somehow, despite all of this fraught, intense political history that had such a tragic human cost, they ended up with a very good ballpark.
Yeah, so the dual kind of forces at play are, one, Walter O'Malley has this really, I think, underrated, kind of underappreciated vision historically to build a baseball-only, modern, spacious, family-friendly ballpark. And he wants to change the way that we think about stadiums and the way that we think about the experience of baseball. He saw the future. Like, he was probably 40, 50 years ahead of his contemporaries on that front. But at the same time, before he can start digging, the city has to forcibly evict some of the final residents. And that eviction became a spectacle, and it was on live television, and it really, really hurt public opinion for the Dodgers for a long time.
Yeah, no, that O'Malley was such a fascinating character because he's of course reviled in Brooklyn as the villain who took the Dodgers away. I learned when I was working on my book that it wasn't so much that O'Malley hated Brooklyn, hated New York, or even necessarily wanted Los Angeles. He hated Ebbets Field, most of all, and which does not mean he was therefore right. Of course, I mean, we all love the memory of Ebbets Field and think on that level he was crazy, but he was not totally crazy given the limits of the vantage point of the early 50s, when Ebbets Field seemed dirty, dark, impossible to renovate, in the wrong neighborhood, and everybody thought that suburbanization was cool and was going to be wonderful, and that the automobile was going to save us all. And so O'Malley, of course, tried to do something more modern in Brooklyn and failed, and then looked to Los Angeles as the place in which, the post-war American dream would play out. But I was fascinated to learn that when the decision had been made to go to Los Angeles, and he started actually actively planning Dodger Stadium, he sent his planning team to go to Disneyland, which at that point was just a few years old, to see how you treated customers. And, here's this place that's all clean and modern and lots of parking and lots of everything else that seemed to be very desirable in the late 1950s. And compared to Ebbets Field, of course, by those measures, it was appealing. And he said essentially he wanted to make a stadium that was to baseball what Disneyland was compared, say, to an old tawdry Carnival Midway.
And it's really hard to underestimate or understate the level of his ambition in doing that.
Yes.
He had plans for Dodger Stadium that, first of all, when Dodger Stadium came out, it was unlike anything else that had ever existed as a ballpark. And it was a spectacle just by its very existence. But, he wanted to build a monorail in the parking lot. He wanted to build these crazy retractable screens that would shield fans from the wind and sun. It was...
Yep.
The level of kind of unachieved ambition of Dodger Stadium is a whole book in itself.
Yeah, that's true. Well, that could be your next one.
I don't know.
Great. What about before we get more into baseball, which we will in a moment, I wanted to ask you a little more about how you got so deeply into the human story of the families that were at the core of that community that was ripped apart in Chavez Ravine.
Sure.
And how did you research that very unbaseball part of it?
That was, to me, always the most important part of the book. That was what drew me to the story probably more than anything else, more than the baseball, more than the politics, was the very human experience of these families that had their home ripped away from them, their community ripped away from them, and then sort of had to have that rubbed in every day with the sound of Vin Scully's voice or with the traffic they would sit in after work with Dodger games going on.
Mm-hmm.
And I found that to be just emotionally powerful. And so I started off with a lot of reading, as you can imagine, and there's been quite a bit of research done on these communities and a fair amount of writing about it. But most of it had been from a sort of anthropological, slightly kind of zoomed out perspective.
Right.
And I wanted to talk to people. So I started to reach out to people I could find who had been written about before, using social media. There's an annual picnic every year at the park across from Dodger Stadium.
Really?
They call themselves Los Desterrados. It's the uprooted, and they are...
Wow. And that group still exists.
I don't think it's going to happen this year, unfortunately. But the level of sort of closeness and unity amongst that community is really remarkable. And it speaks to what kind of communities they had before. Their descendants are there now. There's not that many old timers left. And so really it was just a matter of earning trust and listening and positioning myself as somebody who would be fair and empathetic and understood his own position as an outsider, I think. And then the other aspect was doing sort of the standard historical research of looking at, censuses and old immigration documents and trying to wrangle up old newspapers that might have mentioned the communities and flesh out the picture that way.
Right. Which you really did. There were, I had thought I knew a fair amount about the history of that site, and I realized that I knew only the surface of it after I
still
and you got the trust of these people, obviously.
Those who spoke to me, there was plenty of people who passed or who didn't call me back or who I couldn't even get in touch with, right?
Right.
I hope that more people write about it, and I hope that there's oral histories collected. I think there are some, and there's some organizations. There's one called Buried Under the Blue that's doing a lot of work to preserve the history, and it's important that that goes on and that it goes beyond me, because I'm just a small fish.
Well, not now, but maybe when you started.
Medium.
Now you're right. Now you're at the very least a medium fish, I think. Yeah. Do you enjoy going to Dodger Stadium now after having essentially excavated it? How different is it now? I guess you obviously haven't been there since the book was published, because there is no baseball season right now. But
no, but I've been. I went when I was writing the book.
Right.
And the Dodgers, were in the World Series a couple times when I was writing the book. So it was a good time to be writing it, because the Dodgers were central to sort of culture and life in LA in a way they haven't always been in my life. But on one hand, it's the same, because I've known about the story for a long time and I've been interested in it for a long time. So I've always walked into Dodger Stadium with the understanding that there was something else here.
Right.
On the other hand, it's very different, because now I know the people whose lives were ruined, not just the Arechiga family, but also the Wilkinson family. And I have a much deeper understanding for exactly where the elementary school is buried underneath the parking lot, things like that. Leave you with, I don't know. If they didn't make you feel something, then I think you're probably not doing it right, or not. You don't want to.
Sure, no, of course. And yet, one of the things I admire most about the book is that you didn't fall prey to the kind of the simplistic temptation to have pure heroes and pure villains. I mean, you know that the presence of Dodger Stadium has been an incredibly positive thing in many ways, despite the enormously high price that was paid, and paid obviously cruelly and unfairly by certain people more than others.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in the book, ultimately, kind of money and power went out over both sort of these communities that really embodied the American dream and the sort of, bootstraps vision for the country, and over big, bold, progressive ideas at the time. Both of those things get squashed.
Right.
And when I was writing the book, it struck me as it struck me that it would be too simple to say there's a clear bad guy here, because there wasn't. It's much more tragic than just the Dodgers coming in and kicking out a family. If the story was
that's my point. Yeah,
the story was that simple, it wouldn't be worth a book, probably. The story is really about sort of systems, and it's about power and how these things kind of build and coalesce over years into, and the way that individual lives are sort of thrust up against the rocks, and how people respond to that.
Yep. No, I think that comes through very, very powerfully and very movingly. And also with the housing project, that's the prequel, so to speak, to all this, the earlier chapter, where there was great idealism, and yet today I'm not sure any of us would think that an immense housing project of 13 towers by Richard Neutra, however good an architect he may have been, is exactly the way to build a city or solve a city's housing challenges.
No, I mean, it clearly wasn't. I mean, there was good reason to build, to argue for public housing in Los Angeles, but Robert Alexander was Richard Neutra's partner in designing Elysian Park Heights, as it was going to be called. And later in his memoirs, he wrote about going through the communities and basically kind of planning this really ambitious housing project and they believed in public housing. They were very progressive architects, but he had this thought, and maybe it wasn't a thought that really occurred to him until later, but maybe he had it at the time and just kind of went with the flow, which was that all the things that they were planning for, all the sort of modernist ideals of what housing can be with open space and community and sort of the civic vibrancy, were already there. There that those communities already had those things. I mean, some of them were underserved by city services. That's absolutely the case. And some of the buildings weren't up to code, perhaps because they had been underserved by the city. But the spirit of what Neutra and Alexander were trying to generate, it already existed. And there was some sort of something tragic about kicking that out to just recreate it in a, white man's.
Right. But this was a decade, almost a decade before Jane Jacobs.
Yes.
It was before Herbert Gans had written The Urban Villagers, which documented essentially the same thing at the North End in Boston, and before our whole consciousness changed.
And it's actually really interesting on that note, even amongst the public housing advocates in LA. So the initial renderings were for bungalows, 2-story garden apartments, and kind of a low village. But because of the way the soil was in those hills, a lot of that land wasn't buildable. So they switched to building these towers. And when it became clear that they were going to have to build towers, the project lost a lot of support because West Coast LA housing advocates thought it would have been cruel to make people live in high rises. They were so attached to the notion of kind of living, the way that California lives in the imagination, that they didn't want to subject anybody, even people who they thought of as probably lesser. It was a very paternalistic time to living on the 12th floor, of an apartment building.
Right. Yeah. No, in a way, it was one of the many ways to sort of look at the legacy of this is it was in part defeated by the LA dream of the single family house, that everybody gets a single family house. It's just smaller and less well located if you're poor.
I think that's pretty much what happened.
Which, right, exactly.
Behind those developments were the forces that, ran the Red Scare kind of McCarthy-esque campaigns to defeat housing.
Right, because it was communist and socialist and what have you. In the view of the LA Times, which played a very big role in defeating it, actually, in fact.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Let's get back to baseball for a little while now. What do you think about the absence of a season right now? And can I ask you, as somebody who observes it closely, what you think is going to happen, or should happen, or could happen?
I think anything could happen. I think they'll come to a deal, but I also think that they probably shouldn't play. It seems hard to imagine them pulling off a season safely with travel, with the amount of the amount of cases in places like Florida and Texas and Arizona. There's so many hurdles. The Blue Jays want to play in Toronto, but the Canadian government is telling them not such a good idea. So they would move to spring training, their spring training site in Florida, and Florida is the worst place in the country right now for COVID. So I have a hard time seeing how it's worth it. But there's money on the table, and when there's money to be made, anything can happen.
Right, as your book makes clear.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
What do you think?
So, what do I think? Well, I'm saddened because they've both. Well, nobody's come out of it looking very good, I think, and particularly the owners have not come out of this situation looking very good. And I think if there were truly money to be made, something would have happened, actually. I think the problem is not that there's money to be made, but there's not enough money to be made.
Yeah, that might be.
Yeah, and that's a big reason everybody's fighting over an incredibly shrunken pie right now, and forgetting all of the high-minded talk about baseball's obligation to American culture and American society.
That's actually one of the themes in the book, right? It's sort of so I'm skeptical about that kind of talk, and I'm skeptical about the idea that baseball has that role to play, because I think that the notion of baseball as a national pastime, as this special patriotic thing, has often been a sort of purely business play by savvy owners and merchandisers. going back to the Abner Doubleday myth and Albert
Right.
Spalding perpetuating it to sell sporting goods.
Yep. Exactly. No, one of the things that was fascinating for me in working on my book was discovering how little things have changed, even though everything has changed, and that it has always been a business. Although who was it who said, it's too much of a sport to be a business and too much of a business to be a sport?
I've heard. I don't remember who said.
Yeah, but in fact, the tension has been extreme all along. I remember when all of the high-minded and often very disingenuous talk about it being the great American pastime also arose at a time when there was no other significant professional sport in this country. It was really the first, and for a significant chunk of time, other than boxing, I suppose, it kind of had it to itself. Certainly in terms of major team sports, it had the world to itself for a long time. And and so it could sort of burrow itself deep into the culture that way. And I think to some extent it still is, and all that. I don't think that stuff is total crap created by owners just to justify a business, even though
it's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy that baseball has, decided, and baseball owners and baseball people and boosters in the beginning decided that baseball was going to be this thing. And, you had Mark Twain talking about baseball that way, even in the 19th century. And because people wanted it to be that way, and they put their resources and their time and their energy into make it happen, it did.
Yeah. No, exactly. No, it is an amazing, amazing history. I found that that it is simply impossible to separate out the history of this game from the social and political history of America.
Oh, I agree.
Your book makes that intensely, overpoweringly clear in one slice of one piece of geography over one period of time. But it's actually been true, all the way through. All the class issues, all the issues of labor, all the issues of race, which have deep connections to baseball long before Jackie Robinson. And I learned that many of the early ballparks, including many in northern cities, were completely segregated racially, but also economically. That many of them had bleachers that had separate entrances, separate bathrooms, and no connection to the rest of the stadium, so that the riffraff could not mix with
stadium like that.
Sorry?
I can think of another stadium like that.
Right.
Dodger Stadium has been like that until very recently. The bleachers were totally separate.
Totally separate with no connection. But and that was in the 19th century. That's how almost everything was done. It was considered kind of normal. It reminded me of how at the Metropolitan Opera, in the old Metropolitan Opera in New York, the family circle, the cheap balcony on the top ring, had a separate entrance on the street with its own little lobby and staircase going all the way up, so that the fancy people didn't have to mix with the poor people. They came in the poor door and went upstairs to their seats. So that was done in baseball as well. The notion that the class distinctions began with skyboxes in our age is in fact completely naive. It's always been, which is not to justify it, merely to say that it's a longer, more complicated history than people think sometimes.
Oh yeah, to bring it back again to Dodger Stadium, when O'Malley was building the stadium in the 60s or 50s and to open in 62, he specifically wanted to create an environment where celebrities and wealthy people could come and be feted and feel like celebrities and wealthy people, and then be seen from a distance by the masses, but not have to mingle with them. That was a big part of his marketing strategy.
Yes. In fact, my favorite detail that I discovered working on my book was that O'Malley actually studied the possibility of having the various skyboxes on the top level be drive-in. That they actually envisioned you could drive to the upper level and park your car behind your box and then drive out again, which would be the sort of ultimate LA experience. Thankfully, that did not happen, but they certainly were trying to push it in that direction. Absolutely.
You've done the whole stadium as a drive-in theater.
Yes, right, exactly. We have actually several questions have already come in, and let me encourage anyone with a question to please go to the chat function at the bottom of the screen and type it in. Let me start with one that actually is very specific to the story of Dodger Stadium, and Roz Wyman, who's somebody that you've written about, I think, is part of the story. What was her role in changing the housing project to a stadium? Or did she get involved after that decision? It actually didn't get changed to a stadium. The housing project stopped, and then the stadium came later as the city was trying to figure out what to do with this mostly but not entirely cleared land, right?
Yes, that's right. And so Roz Wyman was a city councilwoman in Los Angeles, a historic city councilwoman. She was elected in 1953 as a 22-year-old woman. She was, I think, the first Jewish council member in LA history, the second woman. Her election was a remarkable achievement. And she ran partly on a platform of bringing Major League Baseball to LA. She was also, a progressive Democrat. She was a pro-housing candidate. But the same election that brought her in also brought in a new mayor named Norris Poulsen. And Poulsen was a patsy of sort of special interests in LA. I mean, he literally said it later in his life. I was a patsy of special interests in LA. It was not a secret. Mm-hmm. And he killed the housing project. So really, Roz Wyman's role was to bring the Dodgers in, and then it becomes murkier when it comes to the evictions of the Arechiga family. She was extremely, I'll say it, she was unsympathetic to their plight. She didn't care about their stance and about their kind of idea that they were going to stay in their home and fight. She wanted them out.
So she was totally invested at that point in the Dodgers coming.
100%. I think the first piece of legislation she proposed was about putting pro baseball in the Coliseum on an experimental level before the Dodgers even came. She was thinking about this stuff from the beginning. And, when Walter O'Malley ends up, opening the park, he gives the only key to the stadium to Roz Wyman.
Wow. Amazing. Here's another question. Would the Dodgers have moved if the New York Giants had not concurrently moved to San Francisco?
No, I don't think so. They couldn't have moved to LA at least. There was kind of a mandate, I think, from the league that they had to go together. There had to be two teams. Otherwise, the travel would have been kind of insufferable.
Right. I believe that's correct. The National League threw a wrench in the works and said that they would not approve a single team moving to California. It had to be a minimum of two teams going west, so as to justify the expense and the time of teams in the East traveling for series of games. So that's exactly right. So in fact, even though the Dodgers and the Giants' fates were very closely tied together, and the Giants came very close to going to Minneapolis.
Yeah, I think they were right on the verge. And
yes, but ultimately did not do so. And then I think if I remember correctly, the Washington Senators then became the Minnesota Twins.
Yes, and Calvin Griffith brought them there, and his statue was just removed from Target Field yesterday.
Right. There we are. All right.
And the present.
Yes, exactly. Okay. Why is LA more of a baseball town than football? No other city out west is. All right. As an LA native, do you want to answer that or try to answer that?
I don't know. I think LA is a baseball town because there's been baseball there consistently for longer than there was football. I mean, the Rams and Raiders left for 20 years,
Right.
more. The people like baseball in LA. The Dodgers have been an incredible team. Dodger Stadium is a beautiful place to go to games. I
Right.
don't know if it's more of a baseball town than other cities in the West, more than, I don't know, Oakland or San Diego. Maybe. I think, I don't know. It just is that way. And you know what? LA is also a big basketball town. I think it's hard to underestimate.
Huge basketball town. Yeah.
As a force in LA kind of sports culture.
But we'll see. Actually, also look as football comes back to LA. I mean, we'll see. I mean, my first reaction to that question was, ask it again in 5 years and let's see. I don't know.
Yeah, football in LA in the early 50s was one of the things that I think kind of pushed baseball to come out west. The pro football was in LA. The Rams, I think, were in LA in 50 or 51.
Yeah. So good. Here's an interesting question that brings us back to Dodger Stadium. The average lifespan of a stadium or arena seems to be 30 years. Tell that to Boston. Why has Dodger Stadium survived design trends such as circular, multi-sport structures, nostalgia-wrapped ballparks, so forth? And why aren't football stadiums, other than the Rose Bowl, linked to romantic interpretations of sport as much as baseball stadiums are?
This is a question for you.
Okay, I can answer it, but we can both answer it, actually. I mean, I think first, Dodger Stadium is unique, as you were saying yourself. Walter O'Malley did have the sense, whatever his other shortcomings were, to resist the trend that was very big in both the 50s and 60s toward multi-sport stadiums, many of which were circular. That's true. And to build a baseball-only ballpark. It's the only one of its decade, if I remember correctly, that was baseball only. In the early 70s, the Royals built a baseball-only ballpark in Kansas City, but everything else being built in the 50s and 60s was multi-sport. And many of them were what I call, concrete donuts. So, I mean, I think Dodger Stadium has survived because it's really good. And it's the real thing. And it's the only really, truly first-rate mid-century baseball-only ballpark there was. And it's, it's now the third oldest ballpark in the major leagues, and it's just had another very respectful, I think, and sensitive renovation, and it's clearly going to be around for, I hope, a very long time to come. I don't know whether you want to add to that.
I think that's right. The Dodgers have invested in keeping it, the different ownership groups, the O'Malley family, the Fox ownership group, even the McCourts to a certain extent, and now the Guggenheim group they put money into the stadium to keep it up. Janet Marie Smith now is the kind of head of Dodger Stadium architecture, and she's done an incredible job of modernizing it without sort of treading on its spirit. And it's also a thing I just found out pretty recently. Do you know what the second oldest ballpark is in the National League after Dodger Stadium?
I should know. Well, people, let's see. Tell us quickly just to not delay us, and I'll feel properly embarrassed. What?
Coors Field in Denver.
Right. Wow.
Like 30 years newer than Dodger Stadium. More.
Right. Wow, that is amazing. Well, yeah, there was an enormous gap. And almost everything built in the years immediately after Dodger Stadium is already gone because most of them were really terrible. And I mean, you mentioned Janet Marie Smith, who played a significant role in Camden Yards in Baltimore, which was the great turning point. And while that the questioner referred to nostalgia-wrapped ballparks. While that is indeed one way to describe Camden Yards, it's actually much, and it does have a certain amount of nostalgia to it, which is not its strongest aspect. It's an incredibly strong design on so many more serious levels too, because it's urbanistically sensitive and beautifully integrated into Baltimore. It's irregular and asymmetrical, and it shows that it's possible to integrate the feel of a traditional ballpark with the somewhat larger footprint of a ballpark that has a better set of modern amenities. So it's a very, very skillful thing. And Janet Marie Smith, I think, is not so much a creature of nostalgia as a creature of helping to create what's appropriate in a particular place and distilling its essence. And that's what she's helped do, overseeing the renovations at Dodger Stadium, knows that the essence of that is a kind of mid-century design, which has been beautifully interpreted as they've continued to develop it. So I'm glad you mentioned her, because she is definitely one of the heroes of contemporary stadiums. Here's a great question that I think is probably also for both of us. All new stadiums, baseball or otherwise, seem to be mired in controversy from the outset, whether it's using public money or repurposing land through dubious means. It's always a battle between public and private interests. Is it possible to ethically build new stadiums? How?
I think it's not. To be quite honest, at least not if they're not replacing old stadiums. I mean, it's something I've been thinking about a lot lately as I've discussed this book, and people have asked me about what's happening in LA, where there's a new football stadium being constructed, and where probably going to be another basketball stadium constructed in Inglewood very soon by the Clippers. And I'm thinking to myself, LA has, if you count Anaheim, which we can count because the Angels call themselves an LA team, they have two baseball stadiums. They have hockey basketball arena in Anaheim. They have Staples Center. They have the Rose Bowl. They have the Coliseum. They have the Home Depot Center. It's not called that anymore, but where the Galaxy play. They have the Bank of California Stadium for soccer next to the Coliseum. They have Forum still standing. They have the new Inglewood football stadium, and now they're going to have another new Inglewood basketball stadium. There's too many stadiums in LA. I mean, this is a city with a huge shortage of housing and a lot of other problems. And it's crazy to me that it's easier for stadiums, even as they are mired in controversies, they get built. It's easier to build those than it is to build things that cities actually need. And until that changes, I don't think there's necessarily an ethical way to build new stadiums.
But and that would the corollary to that, I suppose, would be, at least in baseball, taking care of the ones we have. You know, the thing that I find the most tragic event of the last generation or so is the loss of Tiger Stadium in Detroit. You know, you can't truly forgive the loss of Ebbets Field, but on one level it's easier to understand, because in the 50s, our consciousness of all these issues was so much less than it is now, just as our understanding of the implications of suburban sprawl and the automobile is so much less than it is now. You can sort of understand where Walter O'Malley's head was. But by the time the Tigers were ready to build Comerica Park and move in 2000, I mean, by then we knew better. And that was, you know, a great, extraordinary American ballpark that opened in April of 1912, on the very same day that Fenway Park is opened. Fenway Park is arguably one of the most beloved things in all of Boston, in all of New England. There was a rich history and a lot of wonder to Tiger Stadium, and we could have had it. So part of it, I think, is about caring for what you have and protecting it. But I I mean, it's a very interesting question. Is it possible to ethically build new stadiums? Because some of it does have to do with land and what other purposes it can be put to, and a great deal of it has to do with money and what other purposes that can be put to. The earliest ballparks, of course, were funded entirely by their owners, which nobody does anymore in quite that way.
Not even supposedly privately built ballparks happen in that way now.
Right. Well, because the privately built ballparks it's a bit of a fig leaf, because while the team ownership does put often most and sometimes all of the actual money for bricks and mortar, the land is usually a gift or a cheap deal from the municipality. There are all kinds of other related things about corollary structures and parking and franchises and so forth and so on, which make it less of a privately funded thing than it would appear to be. There's a questioner who asks, what's next for you? Is there another stadium you're passionate to explore and write on?
I'm not sure what's next, but I don't think it will be another stadium book. I don't think I could do it with the same level of passion and feeling that I did this one. Maybe one day, but I also don't know if there's another stadium that I think captures at least my imagination the same way Dodger Stadium does, and that's kind of necessary to write a book.
Well, I don't think there's another story exactly like this. That's the point, I think. I mean, yes, there's a certain amount of richness I discovered working on my book in there's a certain interesting urban development and sociological story behind every single ballpark, but almost none as deep and as powerful emotionally as the one behind Dodger Stadium.
Yeah, and I would even say that the stadium itself is not really the thing in the book. I mean, it obviously is the thing, it's also not, if that makes sense.
But in fact, part of the moral ambiguity of this story that to me makes it particularly interesting is that the stadium is the thing in the fact that out of all this mostly horrible history, we ended up with something rather good, which of course makes it harder to render a simple moral judgment.
It does, and it's also complicated by the fact that had there been a housing project or a community college or a helicopter launching pad or one of the many things that the city contemplated putting there, it's very likely that the lives of the people who lived in those communities would not have been written about by generations of writers and not turned into albums and paintings and murals, and they wouldn't have had the same hold they do. And it's a sad thing, but communities get displaced and wrecked all the time for other things, and people mostly don't pay attention.
Right. Here's an interesting question that comes from one of the great things about being able to do virtual events is that people can tune in from all over. This is from someone in the UK who writes, my question is to do with newer ballparks and the franchise system. Here in the UK, we don't have the franchise system for sports, and teams are an intrinsic part of their communities, particularly in soccer and rugby. With the return of ballparks to downtown, the addition of leisure, housing, and other things in these areas, the investments required are huge, and the roots are therefore planted deep. Does that mean that the franchise system is weakened? Could it be the start of the end for that? It seems to me that a team would be so invested in an area and the area in the team that a move would be almost impossible. It's an interesting thought, isn't it?
It is. I think it's an optimistic thought. I mean, teams will always take the best deal, and it seems like owners are willing to uproot those things if they get what they want. I mean,
you're right. Owners are generally will follow the money before anything else. But let's look at, say, something like Oakland, where the team, the Oakland A's are now playing in the only combined football, baseball stadium from the 60s that is still active. They're very eager to build a baseball-only ballpark. After a couple of false starts, they have a site downtown on the waterfront at Howard Terminal. I think it's a very promising project. It's been designed by Bjarke Ingels, the New York architect. They want to combine it with housing and other things, and they will be the developers of all that stuff, which in effect will subsidize, theoretically, their investment and allow them to actually build the ballpark. But doesn't that also get them more deeply committed to Oakland? And how could they do all that stuff and then decide they're going to move to Las Vegas like the football team did?
I mean, we'll see if they do all that stuff. I think we're still not there yet, and I hope they do. But I suppose, yeah, in that situation, sure. But most of these stadiums are taxpayer gifts ultimately, and
Right.
the game is always leverage, right? I mean, the Texas Rangers we're supposed to open a new ballpark that would have replaced their 20, 30-year-old perfectly good stadium, a mile away or even less this year. The Braves just did this in downtown Atlanta. They moved to the suburbs.
Oh yeah, that's the they are the villains, I think, of my book, because I talk about them toward the end, and that is the most discouraging single thing to have happened to baseball parks in the last generation, I think, is Atlanta, because there's also something very, not even so subtly racist about it, that they chose to go to Cobb County, the only county in metropolitan Atlanta that's not part of the transit system. And basically they're saying the only fans we want are upper middle class fans who live in the suburbs and come in their cars. And they develop this little pretend theme park city around the ballpark, and left the real city.
Yeah, it's terrible. I mean, but that's the stuff that happens still. So I'm not sold on the idea that we're entering a new age yet. I mean, I live in Tacoma, Washington now, and at the time the Sonics moved to Oklahoma City in basketball, I lived in Seattle, different places in between. But I mean, watching the Sonics sort of hold the city hostage and then rip out the heart of every single resident to move to Oklahoma it was traumatic for me, and I didn't even really care about the Sonics. I think I never want to overestimate how much an ownership group cares about the place where their team plays, unfortunately. And I think Walter O'Malley is actually a great lesson in that. He did something miraculous, but he also destroyed the spirits of millions.
And actually, I mean, that's such an interesting and really complicated story too, because had he stayed in Brooklyn, he could have destroyed downtown Brooklyn too, because he actually produced some truly fascinating, futuristic, and appalling schemes for ballparks in downtown Brooklyn that would have been a kind of proto-Astrodome, basically, or proto-Sky Dome.
The Buckminster Dome would have been something.
And it may be one of the few moments where history should be grateful to Robert Moses, since it's Moses who put the kibosh on those things. It shows you that everything is more complicated than we think. We actually have more questions, but we are at the official adjournment time, and our friends at Bookhampton and RJ Julia have reminded me that we are not supposed to go over. So we can gather again some other time and do it a second time, but we need to adjourn at 8 o'clock. So thank you everyone for being here. Again, there are links to buy the books. If you are interested, we would be thrilled, as would the hosts, the bookstores. And I want to ask everyone to please join me in thanking Eric Nusbaum for being with us to mark his new book, which is an important and meaningful read, which gives a whole new dimension to the complexities of this story. So thanks to everybody for being here, and come again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. And yes, Stealing Home and Ballpark can be purchased on our websites, Bookhampton or RJ Julia, or by coming into the store. Finally, yay. Makes a great Father's Day gift, or just a gift for yourself to read while you're spending some time for you. Happy reading all, and thank you for being with us. Good night.